Brenda sat across the polished mahogany mediation table in a bright red power suit and massive gold hoop earrings, demanding I hand over the deed to my side yard and pay her $5,000 for her supposed emotional distress. I just sat there sweating in my only decent suit, holding a lukewarm cup of generic coffee, listening to her slick lawyer threaten me with complete financial ruin. What they did not know was that inside my lawyer's beat-up briefcase rested a county-certified survey proving that Brenda did not just have her property line wrong, but that her prized, custom-built two-story garage was sitting squarely on my land. My name is Mark. I am 28 years old, and I work a mind-numbing office job staring at spreadsheets all day. All I wanted was to sit on my sagging back porch in peace. But this miserable nightmare decided to try and steal my property so she could park construction equipment. Before I tell you how I ended up legally taking her entire building for free, let me take you back to the freezing, rainy afternoon when this entitled bully drove a neon pink stake into my grass and sealed her own fate. Have you ever met someone whose entire personality is just a massive homeowner association violation? You know exactly the type of person I am talking about. Let me tell you about Brenda. Brenda was my neighbor, and I use the word neighbor extremely loosely because that implies some sort of friendly, mutual coexistence. No, Brenda was more like a localized natural disaster that wore leopard print leggings and smelled like cheap vanilla perfume mixed with pure malice. I had just bought my first house. It was nothing special, just a little 3-bedroom ranch that needed a lot of work. But it was mine. I was 28 years old, working a mind-numbing office job where I stared at spreadsheets for 8 hours a day, and all I wanted in the world was to come home, sit on my slightly sagging back porch, crack open a cold generic brand soda, and enjoy the silence. But Brenda made that impossible. Let me paint a picture of this woman for you because you need to understand the level of pure, unadulterated entitlement we are dealing with here. Brenda drove a massive, pristine, white luxury sports utility vehicle. This thing was basically a tank. It was the size of a small school bus, and she had absolutely zero idea how to drive it. Every single day, she would back out of her driveway at 2 miles per hour, completely oblivious to anything in her mirrors, and she would invariably park it halfway on the street and halfway on the grass. Her yard was a nightmare. She had those blinding white security floodlights that look like they belong in a maximum security prison, and she had them pointed directly at my living room window. If I wanted to watch television after 8 o'clock at night, I had to close my blackout curtains. Otherwise, I felt like I was being interrogated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and her garden decorations were a crime against humanity. She had maybe 30 ceramic frogs staring at you from the bushes and about 15 sets of wind chimes. Let me tell you, when the wind blew even a tiny bit, it sounded like a haunted scrapyard next door. But I am a quiet guy. I avoid conflict. I figured I would just ignore her, build a nice tall wooden privacy fence eventually, and live my life. I'm not a superhero. I am not the kind of guy who goes over there and kicks down the door. I just wanted peace. But Brenda was the kind of person who saw peace and took it as a personal insult. It started with small things. I would find her perfectly manicured lawn clippings blown all over my driveway. I would see her stupid little designer dog, which looked like a dusty mop with anger issues, doing its business right next to my mailbox. I would bite my tongue, clean it up, and go back inside. That was my first mistake. When you give a person like Brenda an inch, they do not just take a mile. They take the mile, pave it, and then charge you a toll to walk on it. The real nightmare began on a Tuesday afternoon. I had just gotten home from work. It was pouring rain, one of those miserable autumn days where the sky is gray and everything is damp. I pulled into my driveway, and through the rain, I saw Brenda standing in my side yard. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat and holding a rubber mallet. She was pounding wooden stakes into the ground, and attached to these stakes was a neon pink string. I sat in my car for a solid 2 minutes, just staring through the windshield, watching my wipers go back and forth, trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was witnessing. She was essentially drawing a line right down the side of my property, about 10 feet past the invisible boundary between our yards, completely swallowing up my side lawn and a beautiful old oak tree that I loved. I grabbed my jacket, stepped out into the freezing rain, and walked over to her. My shoes were instantly soaked. I tried to keep my voice calm, but my heart was pounding out of my chest. I said, "Brenda, what exactly are we doing here?" She turned around, completely unfazed. She had these oversized, ridiculous designer sunglasses on, despite the fact that it was raining and completely overcast. She pushed the sunglasses up her nose and gave me this smile that made my blood boil. It was a tight, condescending little smirk. She looked at me like I was a slightly confused toddler. She said, "Oh, I am just marking the actual property line. My husband and I are going to extend our driveway, and we need this space for the contractors to park their equipment." I stood there in the rain, water dripping down my neck, absolutely dumbfounded. I told her, "Brenda, your property line ends at the edge of your current driveway. You are 10 feet onto my land. You are practically touching my water meter." She let out this laugh. I cannot even describe the sound of it properly. It sounded like a chain-smoking seagull. It was this harsh, grating noise that scraped against my eardrums. She said, "Well, that is where you are wrong. We have lived here for 15 years. The previous owner of your house, God rest his soul, was a very confused old man. He never knew where the lines were. I checked the city maps from 1998, and we actually own all the way past this tree. Now please excuse me, I have to finish this before my Pilates class." She literally turned her back on me and started hammering another stake into my grass. I am not a violent person, but in that moment, the amount of self-control it took not to rip that wooden stake out of the ground and throw it into the street was monumental. My hands were shaking. I told her very firmly to get off my property and take her string with her. She stopped hammering, stood up straight, and gave me this cold, dead stare. Her face turned a shade of crimson that usually indicates a stroke, and veins popped in her neck. She pointed a perfectly manicured fake acrylic fingernail right at my chest and said, "You listen to me, you little punk. I know the mayor. I know the zoning board. This is my land, and if you touch these stakes, I will have you arrested for vandalism." Then she marched back to her house, her heavy boots squishing in the mud. I went inside, stripped off my wet clothes, and sat on my couch in the dark. I was shaking, partly from the cold rain, but mostly from adrenaline and anger. I did not know what to do. I did not have thousands of dollars for lawyers. I just had my mortgage, my boring job, and my desire to be left alone. I thought maybe she was bluffing. I thought maybe she would wake up the next day, realize she was acting like an absolute lunatic, and pull the stakes up. I was so incredibly naive. 2 weeks passed. The stakes stayed in the ground. The pink string fluttered in the wind, taunting me every time I looked out the window. I tried calling the non-emergency police line, but they told me it was a civil matter and they could not get involved unless things got violent. I tried calling the city planning office, but I was put on hold for 45 minutes by a woman who sounded like she wanted to die, only to be told I had to submit a formal complaint in writing, which would take up to 90 days to process. Brenda knew exactly how slow the system was, and she was banking on me giving up. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Saturday. I was in my kitchen making a terrible cup of instant coffee when someone knocked on my front door. I opened it to find a guy in a cheap windbreaker holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was me. I said yes. He handed me the envelope, said, "Consider yourself served," and walked away. I stood in my doorway staring at the envelope. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I walked to the kitchen table, ripped it open, and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. My hands were sweating so much I was leaving damp prints on the paper. I started reading. Brenda and her husband were officially suing me. The lawsuit claimed adverse possession, a prescriptive easement, and about a half dozen other terrifying legal terms I did not understand. They were claiming that because they had supposedly maintained that strip of land for 15 years, it now legally belonged to them. They were asking the court to quiet title the land in their name, and they were also suing me for $5,000 in damages for emotional distress because I had yelled at her in the rain. Emotional distress. I almost threw up my coffee. I spent the rest of the weekend in a state of absolute panic. You know that feeling, right? That heavy, suffocating weight on your chest when you feel completely trapped. I looked at my savings account. I had exactly $1,400 to my name. I could not afford a lengthy legal battle against a woman who drove a car that cost more than my entire house. I felt defeated. I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by legal papers, and genuinely considered just giving her the land. It was just grass, right? Just a stupid tree. Maybe if I gave it to her, she would leave me alone. But then I looked out the window. I saw her stupid, blinding floodlights. I heard her obnoxious wind chimes clanging in the breeze. I saw her giant white sports utility vehicle parked halfway on my newly claimed lawn. And something inside me just snapped. No, absolutely not. I was not going to let this miserable, entitled bully steal my property just because she felt like it. I was going to fight her, even if it bankrupted me. Monday morning, I called out sick from work. I spent 4 hours calling every property surveyor in the county. Most of them were booked out for months. Finally, I got a hold of a guy named Chuck. Chuck sounded like he had been smoking unfiltered cigarettes since the 1970s. He had a rough, gravelly voice and told me he could squeeze me in on Thursday afternoon for $600. It was almost half my savings, but I told him to do it. Thursday rolled around. Chuck arrived in a battered red pickup truck that was more rust than metal. He was wearing faded denim overalls and a trucker hat. He looked like he had seen 1,000 property disputes and hated every single one of them. He dragged his heavy equipment out of his truck, these tripods and digital measuring devices, and started walking the perimeter of my yard. Brenda, of course, was watching. She came out onto her back patio, holding a mug of coffee, wearing a silk robe that looked completely absurd for the middle of the afternoon. She had that smug smirk on her face again. She yelled out over the fence, "You are wasting your money, kid. The maps are clearly on my side." Chuck did not even look at her. He just kept adjusting his tripod, spitting a sunflower seed onto the grass, and writing things down in a little waterproof notebook. He spent 3 hours out there. He went to the street corner, dug into the asphalt to find the original metal pins placed by the city, and measured everything with pinpoint precision. I was pacing back and forth on my porch, chewing my fingernails down to the quick. This was the oh crap moment. I was terrified he was going to come back and tell me she was right. What if the old man who owned the house before me really had messed up? What if I was fighting a losing battle? Finally, Chuck packed up his gear and walked over to my porch. He took off his hat, wiped his forehead with a dirty rag, and pulled a large, rolled-up sheet of paper out of a tube. He unrolled it on my patio table. It was a highly detailed map of our 2 properties, covered in precise measurements and bright red lines. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the map. "Well, buddy," he said in his gravelly voice, "I have good news, and I have bad news." My heart stopped. "Just give it to me straight, Chuck," I said. Chuck tapped the paper. "The bad news is, the fence in your backyard is about 6 inches over the line onto her side." I groaned. Great. Now she could sue me for that, too. "And the good news?" I asked. Chuck let out a low chuckle. It sounded like gravel tumbling in a cement mixer. "The good news is that her pink stakes are completely wrong. Not only is your side yard entirely your property, but the actual property line runs at a harsh angle right across her lot." He traced his finger along a bright red line on the paper. I leaned in, trying to understand what I was looking at. My eyes widened. My brain literally stopped working for a second. I looked from the map up to Brenda's yard and back to the map. "Wait," I stammered, pointing at the drawing. "Are you telling me Chuck nodded slowly, a massive grin spreading across his wrinkled face. "Yep," he said. "Her precious driveway, the one she wants to extend? Almost half of it is paved on your land. And that giant, custom-built, 2-story detached garage in the back where her husband parks his classic sports car? I could barely breathe." "Yes?" Chuck tapped the map hard. 70% of that garage is sitting square on your property. She does not just owe you a side yard, son. She owes you half her driveway in a 2-story building. I stood there in complete silence. The sheer magnitude of what Chuck had just revealed washed over me. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my chest. It started as a small chuckle and turned into a full-blown, hysterical, laughing fit. I was laughing so hard my eyes were watering. Chuck just stood there, smiling, packing up his tube. Brenda had tried to steal 10 feet of my grass to park construction equipment, and in doing so, she had forced me to legally prove that I owned her driveway and her highly prized garage. I paid Chuck his $600. It was the best money I had ever spent in my entire life. I took the official, stamped survey documents and locked them in a fireproof safe in my bedroom. I did not go outside. I did not tell Brenda. I did not want to give her a single second to prepare. The next step was finding a lawyer. I knew I could not represent myself against her expensive attorneys. I started researching real estate lawyers in my city and found a guy named Davis. Davis was not a billboard lawyer. He operated out of a tiny, cramped office above a dry cleaner downtown. He wore suits that looked slightly too big for him and had a permanent coffee stain on his tie. But his online reviews painted him as an absolute bulldog in the courtroom. I gathered all my paperwork, the lawsuit Brenda served me, the official survey, and photos of her pink steaks, and went to his office. Davis sat behind a desk piled high with manila folders. He silently read through Brenda's lawsuit, shaking his head. Then he picked up Chuck's survey. He stared at it for a long time. The silence in the room was heavy. I was nervous. Was it a mistake? Did I misread it? Davis slowly looked up from the paper. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at me and smiled. It was a terrifying smile. It was the smile of a predator that just spotted a wounded gazelle. He said, "Tell me, does she know about this survey?" I shook my head. "No, I have not said a word." Davis leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "is beautiful. They sued you under the assumption that they had a slam-dunk prescriptive easement claim. But by filing this lawsuit, they have legally opened the door for us to counter-sue to quiet title on the true property lines. They thought they were bringing a knife to a fistfight, but they accidentally handed us a loaded rocket launcher. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the countersuit. We were not just asking the judge to dismiss her ridiculous claims. We were demanding that Brenda and her husband immediately vacate my property, remove all unauthorized structures, which meant tearing up her driveway and demolishing her custom garage, and pay all of my legal fees. Davis told me it would cost a flat fee of $2,000 to handle the case. I did not have it. I went to the bank the next day, took out a personal loan at a terrible interest rate, and handed Davis a cashier's check. I was all in. There was no going back now. The legal process is not like the television shows. It is incredibly slow and agonizing. Months went by. It was now the middle of winter. Brenda still had her pink steaks in the frozen ground. Every time I saw her, she gave me that same smug, arrogant look. She thought she had won because I was staying quiet. She would intentionally rev her loud sports utility vehicle early in the morning just to wake me up. She would leave her blinding floodlights on 24 hours a day. I just smiled to myself, drinking my terrible coffee, knowing the storm that was coming for her. Finally, a date was set for mandatory mediation. In my state, before a civil case goes to trial before a judge, you have to sit down with a neutral mediator and try to settle it. Davis told me this was our moment. We were going to drop the bomb. The mediation took place in a sterile, windowless conference room in a downtown office building. I arrived with Davis. I was wearing my only decent suit, sweating nervously. A few minutes later, Brenda walked in with her husband. Her husband looked like a guy who had given up on life 20 years ago. He just trailed behind her, looking exhausted. Brenda, however, was dressed like she was going to a gala. She had on a bright red power suit, massive gold hoop earrings, and carried a designer handbag that probably cost more than my car. Following them was their lawyer, a slick guy with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch. We all sat down at the large oval table. The mediator, an older woman with kind eyes, explained the rules and asked Brenda's lawyer to state their case. The slick lawyer stood up. He smoothed his tie and began to speak with a voice like butter. He talked about how Brenda and her husband had peacefully maintained the side yard for 15 years. He talked about how I was a hostile neighbor who yelled at Brenda in the rain, causing her severe emotional distress. He showed pictures of the pink stakes, claiming this was the historic boundary line. He said they were willing to be generous. If I signed over the deed to the side yard, they would drop the $5,000 emotional distress claim. He sat down, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Brenda leaned forward, crossed her arms, and gave me a look of pure pity. It was infuriating. She said, "You should take the deal. It is the smart thing to do." The mediator turned to Davis. "Do you have a response, counselor?" Davis did not stand up. He did not smooth his tie. He just casually opened his beat-up briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. He handed a copy to the mediator and then slid a copy across the smooth wooden table toward Brenda's slick lawyer. "We reject the offer," Davis said, his voice completely flat. "In fact, we have filed a countersuit. We are asking that your clients immediately cease trespassing on my client's land." The slick lawyer picked up the document. He glanced at the front page, looking bored. Then, he turned to the second page, which was a blown-up copy of Chuck's official stamp survey. I watched the slick lawyer's face. It was one of the most satisfying moments of my entire life. I watched as his eyes scanned the red lines. I watched as his eyebrows slowly crept up his forehead. I watched as the color completely drained from his cheeks. He went from looking like a confident shark to looking like a man who just realized he forgot his parachute halfway down a skydive. He swallowed hard. He looked at Brenda, then looked back at the paper. Brenda noticed the change in his demeanor. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shrill. "What does it say?" Her lawyer slowly slid the survey toward her. "Brenda," he said, his voice much quieter now. "Did you ever have a survey done before you built the garage?" Brenda waved her hand dismissively. "No, why would we?" The old man told us where the line was. We trusted him. The slick lawyer rubbed his forehead. "Well, according to this state-certified survey, the old man was wrong." Brenda looked at the map. She stared at it for a long, painful minute. I could physically see the gears grinding in her head as she tried to comprehend the drawing. Then she exploded. "This is fake!" she screamed, slamming her hand on the table. Her massive gold earrings rattled. "He drew this. He is lying. This is a forged document." Davis finally smiled, his predator's smile. "Mom," he said calmly, "that is an official survey stamped by the county. If you believe it is fake, you are welcome to hire your own surveyor. But I assure you, the metal pins in the ground do not lie. You do not own the side yard. In fact, you built a 2-story permanent structure on my client's property." Brenda's husband finally spoke. His voice cracked. "Wait," he said, staring at the map. "The garage. The garage is on his land." Davis nodded. 70% of it, yes, and a good portion of your driveway. Our countersuit demands that you remove the encroaching structures within 60 days at your own expense and restore the land to its original condition. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning vent. Brenda was no longer red. She was completely pale. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her, Demolishing a custom-built, two-story garage and ripping up a concrete driveway would cost tens of thousands of dollars, not to mention the loss of property value. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered fiercely in her ear. I could not hear everything, but I heard the words catastrophic and settle. Brenda looked at me. The arrogance was completely gone. Her eyes were wide with panic, but she still could not let go of her pride. You cannot do this, she hissed at me. You cannot force us to tear down our garage. My husband's classic car is in there. I looked her dead in the eye. I felt no pity. I remembered her hammering those stakes into the ground. I remembered the smug look on her face when she threatened me with the mayor. I remembered the weeks of anxiety, the sick feeling in my stomach, the money I had to borrow just to defend myself. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Brenda, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. You sued me. You dragged me into this. You tried to steal my land just so you could park construction equipment. I just wanted to be left alone. Now you have two choices. You can pay contractors to demolish your garage and rip up your driveway, or we can go before a judge, and I will let the court force you to do it. The mediator stepped in. Perhaps we can find a compromise, she suggested. A property line adjustment? The defendants could purchase the land from the plaintiff? Brenda's lawyer jumped on that. Yes, absolutely. We would be willing to purchase that parcel of land from your client at fair market value. Davis looked at me. It was my call. I thought about it. Fair market value for a tiny strip of land was maybe a few $1,000s. It would cover my legal fees, sure, but it meant Brenda still won. She would get to keep her garage, keep her driveway, and she would still be my miserable neighbor. I shook my head. No, I said. I do not want to sell. Brenda gasped. What do you mean you do not want to sell? We will give you $10,000 for a useless patch of dirt. It is not useless to me, I replied. It is my dirt. The mediation ended without an agreement. We walked out of that building, and I felt £1,000,000 lighter. Brenda looked like she was going to throw up. Over the next 3 weeks, her lawyer desperately tried to negotiate with Davis. The offers kept going up. $12,000, $15,000, $20,000. It was a lot of money, more money than I had ever seen. But I told Davis to decline every single offer. I was not doing this for money. I was doing this to teach a bully a lesson. When they realized I was not going to sell, panic fully set in. They hired their own surveyor. He came out, walked the property, and confirmed exactly what Chuck had found. They had no legal defense. They had built a massive structure on land they did not own, and they had initiated a lawsuit that forced the issue into the light. Eventually, their lawyer reached out with a different proposal. Brenda and her husband could not afford the demolition costs. They were already overextended on their mortgage, the luxury sports utility vehicle, and their lavish lifestyle. If they had to tear down the garage, they would face financial ruin. So, they offered a settlement. They would drop their lawsuit completely. In exchange for me dropping the demolition demand, they would legally deed the garage and that section of the driveway over to me, pay my legal fees in full, and build a brand new 6-foot-tall privacy fence exactly on the new property line, effectively separating the garage from their house and attaching it to my yard. Davis told me it was a massive win. I would be acquiring a building worth $50,000 for free. I accepted the deal. The day the contractors came to build the fence was the best day of my life. I sat on my sagging back porch, drinking my generic cola, watching a crew of men dig holes and pour concrete right down the middle of what used to be Brenda's massive driveway. They erected a beautiful, solid wood fence that completely blocked my view of her house. It blocked her blinding floodlights. It muffled the sound of her annoying wind chimes. And the best part? The fence was built so that her prized 2-story garage was now entirely on my side of the barrier. She had to move her husband's classic sports car out of the garage before the fence went up. I watched him back it out slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Brenda stood in her yard, wearing oversized sunglasses, watching her precious she-shed get swallowed up by my property. She did not say a single word to me. Once the fence was finished, I walked over to my new garage. I unlocked the heavy side door and stepped inside. It was beautiful, fully insulated, finished drywall, epoxy floors, and custom lighting. It was completely empty, echoing slightly as I walked around. I looked out the second-story window of the garage over the new wooden fence and directly down into Brenda's pristine backyard. I decided right then and there what I was going to do with my new space. I did not own a classic car. I did not need a workshop, but I did need a place to relax. Over the next few months, I turned that garage into the ultimate sanctuary. I moved a massive television in there. I bought a ridiculously comfortable couch. I set up a gaming system. And as a tiny, petty tribute to my former neighbor, I bought a single hideous ceramic garden frog and placed it right on the windowsill, facing her house. I never heard a peep from Brenda again. She stopped parking her giant sports utility vehicle on the street because her driveway was now too short, forcing her to carefully squeeze it into her remaining space. The blinding security lights were permanently blocked by the tall fence. And on quiet autumn evenings when it was raining, I would go out to my huge, custom-built garage, sit on my comfortable couch, and listen to the rain hitting the roof of the building she paid for. It is funny how things work out. She wanted to take 10 feet of my grass so her contractors could park comfortably. Instead, she bought me a 2-story man cave and finally gave me the peace and quiet I wanted all along. The legal system is slow, it is expensive, and it is incredibly stressful. But sometimes, just sometimes, the person who digs a trap for someone else ends up falling headfirst into it themselves. So if you ever find a pink stake in your yard, do not just roll over, fight back. You never know, you might just end up with a free garage out of the deal.